Sabe o caminheiro sob o céu por onde for, caminha o tempo inteiro como o chão fosse um tambor. Sonha se cantando, canta sempre mais além, com todos caminhando o vasto mundo de ninguém. Sob o caminheiro, sob o céu por onde for, caminha o tempo inteiro como o chão fosse um tambor.
So my name is Montserrat Soler, and I study religion and ritual, primarily in Brazil, and also the relationship of religion with cooperation.
In your training, what did you feel were some of the biggest unanswered questions, or some of the most driving mysteries that would inspire what you decided to focus on?
Religion, which is why I decided to focus on that. When I started my PhD in the early 2000s, there just was not a lot of material out there on the evolution of religion. I grew up in Mexico, where everybody is somewhat religious, and so it just seemed like a very natural part of my life growing up. And then when you travel and go to other places, you realize that it's not. And to me, this has always been sort of a personally very fascinating question. And when I started, there just wasn't that much material on it. And in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been sort of an explosion on this, and people call it the cognitive science of religion, the evolutionary study of religion. But when I started, there wasn't much on that at all. So to me, that seemed like a really fundamental part of human behavior. Why do people do the things they do? A lot of that motivation comes from religious ideas. And if you look at it from an outsider perspective, there is no pragmatic reason for this, which is really, from the point of view of evolution, a huge mystery. Why would we spend all these resources and time and effort on something that does not seem to have pragmatic benefits on the face of it? So that's why I ended up focusing on religion. And now it's become a field that's really come into its own in the last 10, 15 years.
What are some of the theories? Why would people spend so much energy and time for things that don't apparently have any obvious benefit?
So there's two lines of thought that come from different disciplines, from different backgrounds. And one of those is from psychology and cognitive science primarily. And the idea there is that many of our religious behaviors and our religious cognitions, the way we think about religion, are byproducts of other cognitive capacities that do have an adaptive function. And then religion sort of grew out of that as a sort of evolutionary accident in some way. And I think it's a good set of theories, and then there's been a lot of evidence that points to that being the case. The part that comes from the other field, which is anthropology, tries to explain what about those cognitions and those behaviors might be adaptive. And what the evidence seems to show is that religion is a very powerful motivator for intra-group cooperation. So cooperation within groups, and at the same time, it seems to also promote more effective competition with other groups, which seems to be a really important part of human evolution. We probably evolved in groups that competed with each other. So there's two sides to that story, and the relationship between religion and cooperation, that's the area that I've worked most closely with. That part of my research I've done in Brazil, in the northeast of Brazil, in a city called Salvador da Bahia, which is primarily, it's considered the center of Afro-Brazilian culture, because I was the main port of entry for the slave trade for many centuries. So today, one of the things that makes it unique is that it has a very high concentration of people who practice one of the many variants of Afro-Brazilian religion, and it's a particularly famous one called Candomble, which is related to other religions of the African diaspora in different parts of Latin America, particularly the Caribbean, like Santeria in Cuba or Voodoo in Haiti. The Brazilian version, Candomble specifically, is organized in independent religious homes or communities called terreiros. So each of these communities is a membership of people, of followers of a specific leader, either a woman or a man. And they help each other in many different ways. It's this community centers of sort. And because many people come from low-income situations, it can be a really important source of support. So part of my research was looking at how religion and religious commitment promotes willingness to cooperate with other people in one's community, and what are some of the mechanisms that prevent people from simply joining a group to get the benefits of membership, the benefits of social support, without sort of paying the costs that make the group sustain itself, that allow it to remain active. and functional.
So did you have any hypotheses going in about what you would find or expectations?
Yes, so the idea that people do costly things, that's one of the most salient aspects of religion, is the dramatic rituals that people engage in. And sometimes these rituals seem very wasteful and very unnecessary from an outsider's perspective, because people put so much effort and time, and sometimes they don't have the resources to do this, but they still do it. So the question is why? And this presents a real puzzle. Why would people do all of this? And one of the theories that come from this comes from costly signaling theory. The idea that people do this because it's a way of communicating to others that you are committed to this particular group, that you are willing to pay those costs, and it's a cost that can be sustained through somebody's time in a community, through their membership. So you're constantly displaying your willingness to be part of that community. And that allows people to trust you and to cooperate with you, and prevents people who are not committed from coming in and exploiting the resources of other people.
And so is the theory that this develops at a genetic basis, or is this sort of a culturally learned behavior that's then adopted down the line? People don't necessarily know why they're adopting it, but they just follow others' lead, essentially.
Right. Well, it's interesting because there is a whole literature that comes from the social sciences that does not come from evolutionary theory, that talks about the same sort of behaviors, like conspicuous consumption, buying very expensive things that are costly because they have a social value and you can communicate something through them. We also see a parallel theory that developed in evolutionary biology, that is where the basis, the theoretical basis for this comes from. The idea is that even though these things can pop up in many different cultural contexts, there seems to be some evolved cognitive bias to both take part in costly behaviors and also to be very aware of when others perform those behaviors, to be perceptive of when other people do that and what that tells us about others. So I would argue that there's an evolved basis for that, even though it takes many different shapes, as we expect it to do across different cultures.
So the argument there is that there is a culturally evolved aspect, but there's also a degree to which genetically humans apparently are predisposed to being sensitive or to find certain particular things especially salient.
Yes.
That are related to this particular phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I've become more interested in the last few years, this sort of receiver psychology aspect of what aspects of our cognition are evolved there because we pay attention to what happens around us, and what sort of signals are more salient to individuals, and what sort of signals are ignored. And that has to do with physical constraints. We are not bats, so we can't echolocate, so that kind of signal we'll never be able to catch. But there seem to be certain signals that we're really aware of, and some of them are very simple, like, for example, the color red is something that we pay attention to, and that seems to have very deep evolutionary roots, because red is a color that in nature is associated with all sorts of different displays in animals, and with all sorts of different fruits, for example, because it attracts pollinators and things of that nature. So that's a psychological constraint. We pay attention to that because we have a bias to do that. But apart from those sort of perceptual constraints, there's probably also cognitive constraints that are much more difficult to pin down, but that are likely also there because they're part of our evolutionary history. And costly signaling might well be one of them.
Right. So was this the approach you were going into the Brazilian case study site with? Were you expecting to find this or evidence for this theory about costly signaling?
Yes, I came with the idea that one of the unique things about Candomble is that it's a very sumptuous sort of a religion. There's a lot of very expensive feasts. They are elaborate feasts. They take up a lot of time. They take up a lot of money, a lot of effort to put together. And yet, most of the people who are part of this are people who are low income. They live in sort of shanty towns or favelas of Brazil. Many of them are unemployed. So on the face of it, they shouldn't be spending their resources doing this, because what are they getting out of it? So my hypothesis going in is that the reason that this happens is because if you participate in these religious communities, then in return you get a network of cooperation, and it seems to be the case in this particular community.
So how did you go about testing that, and what did you find exactly?
So I had a couple different ways in which I measure that. One of the things I did was, because there's a lot of religiosity scales that already exist in psychology, but they are very much geared towards Christianity and other major religions. There's not a lot of them that are appropriate for these more local traditions. So one of the things I ended up doing was creating a religious commitment scale that was specific to Candomble when I was in the field, through a lot of interviews, and after the interviews through some statistical procedures, factor analysis and all sorts of different things to determine which items correlated with religiosity or captured that element of religious commitment. So that was one of my measures. I also played an economic game, which is something that has become popularized in the field, which essentially allows people to play with real money in contexts where they would gain by not cooperating. And when they cooperate, they actually need to trust other people in their group because they don't know if everybody else is also going to cooperate. So specifically, the more religious they were, the more likely they were to cooperate with others. And in some cases, also, the more likely they were to receive cooperative acts from others in their group.
So a lot of people in the secular West, particularly people who consider themselves, especially secular, atheist, agnostic, would probably find this, if not unsettling, they would say, yeah, but I'm not religious and I cooperate with people. So what is this saying about non-religious people? What would the answer from your research's perspective be to that statement?
I think in this, for this particular problem, I think religion is one way in which we create commitments to groups. There's many other ways, and there's many secular ways, and there's many secular institutions that use similar mechanisms. If you think, for example, about the army, and if you think about political parties or fraternities, all sorts of different examples of creating commitments through rituals, and they may be secular rituals, but they certainly are there, and a feeling of belonging to a particular group. I think that's a very inherent part of the human experience. I think the difference is that religiosity seems particularly good at creating these commitments, and we're not entirely sure why, and that's certainly the next step in this kind of research. What is it about religiosity, and what kind of religiosity too, because it's important to keep in mind that not all religions have the same ideas concerning morality. But regardless of those ideas of morality and how concerned either the deities in that particular religion or the ideas of that particular religion, regardless of how closely concerned they are with moral behavior, it still seems that religiosity has that power to promote cohesion and cooperation in group members, and it seems like it does that to a bigger extent than other secular institutions. So it's a really interesting question why religion seems powerful in that way. And it's not that religious people are more moral than non-religious people, but they are more willing to cooperate or behave in a cooperative manner with members of their own group. So we're really talking about a mechanism that creates a strong sense of group cohesion, and religion seems to be very good at that. So no, I don't think religion is going anywhere. I think what does happen, and again, I think this is where evolution can help us understand human behavior, is that when things get rough, when we're in a situation of uncertainty or danger, that seems to be a context in which religious ideas flourish particularly well. And that might have evolutionary implications or explanations attached to that. So part of the reason that people have argued we don't see high levels of religion in many secular countries is that there are secular institutions that seem to do some of the jobs that religion does in places where those institutions are weak or they don't exist. So that might be why in some parts of the world religiosity seems to have declined. But I think as long as we have the human brains that we do, we're still going to see not just religion, but a much broader set of behaviors and beliefs that in the West we like to put outside of religion, but in many other parts of the world are not necessarily distinguished from what we think of as religious beliefs.
As a person who studies religion, what is your operationalized concept of what religion is? What counts as religion? What doesn't?
That's a very good question and a very tough question. I don't think there is a good definition of religion. People have tried, but it's a very fuzzy sort of category. And I think in the West, we tend to compartmentalize not just religion, but many other institutions, which in other parts of the world are not so clear-cut. So when we talk about religion, we're talking about a very broad suite of behaviors and cognitions and beliefs that we use in many other contexts, except in the West, we don't tend to call those religion, and in other parts of the world, they might be called religion. So it's difficult. In my own research, in my own mind, I try to think of elements associated with religion, and rather than try to bound the category, because if you do that, you're going to run into trouble very quickly. So yeah, and that's I think a really crucial ideas in terms also of communicating the kind of research that I do. It's really important to get that point across, that what one person, particularly in the West, might think of as religion does not necessarily apply to other parts of the world. That category may not be as clear cut or as bounded as we like to think it is.
Do any examples come to mind?
One thing that comes to mind is health. In the group of people that I work with, there's a lot of rituals that are aimed at improving health, and a lot of times and health in a very broad sense. So this can be specific ailments, but it can also be more general, sort of psychosomatic illnesses or symptoms like headaches or stomach aches or backaches that don't seem to have a very specific explanation. And that's all bound in the context of supernatural explanations and supernatural solutions to these particular problems. In the West, we don't tend to do that, but we go to the psychologist or the therapist because we feel a little off, and maybe if we talk about it and if we breathe and do some meditation exercises, we'll be fine. And we self-medicate with mind-altering substances that in other parts of the world are perfectly legitimate ways in a religious context of making somebody feel better. So that's one example of where categories of medicine and self-help and secular, spiritual, religion, it's not very clear where one begins and when one ends.
Do you think that the academic silo or box that's called religious
Yes.
studies in the West is more an artifact of just how the West has thought about religion historically?
Oh.
What you're studying is more...
I mean, this is certainly not my idea. This is something that, particularly in anthropology, has been around for many years. The idea that religion is an analytical category created by the West and by Western scholars, like many other scholarly categories. And I think that's certainly true, and it's something that people who are more science-based should take to heart and think about very carefully when they're looking at this kind of research. On the other hand, I think, unfortunately, what that has meant for a lot of cultural anthropology is simply moving away from this kind of research that is systematic and that tries to find general explanations. And so it has been the attitude has been, well, it's very difficult to define, it's an analytical construct, so therefore let's simply not attempt to find an explanation for this. And I think that's a mistake as well. I think that it's important to recognize that those are constructed categories, but I think there's also something real there that can be investigated scientifically and cross-culturally, and it can tell us a lot of very interesting things about human behavior and human evolution.
As a researcher who studies religion rather than
Yes.
someone who studies something else and comments on religion,
Yeah.
what do you think your particular line of research, or those of your colleagues, brings to light with respect to the way that religion has been criticized or explained by others?
I think it's really unfortunate that what people associate with studies of the evolution of religion are those kinds of writings that are essentially ideological writings that use and sort of cherry pick some of the research and then place them in this really politicized context that has very little to do with what most people are actually researching. Most people who are doing the research are interested in explanations in why do people do this and what are some of the adaptive mechanisms behind this. So in my view, it seems like that kind of presentation cherry picks things that serve a political view, and that really misses a lot of the really interesting parts of religion that really tell us a lot about human evolution and human behavior. And partly is, I think, the fault of academics, because there should be more communication with the public about the kind of research that we do in ways that represents it more accurately, rather than letting that be hijacked a little bit by political ideologies that are not so much about presenting research, but about activism against religiosity. Which, I mean, sure, religion, there's a lot of things about religion that end up in negative consequences, but that is true of absolutely every other human institution. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Saravá, para as 7 linhas. Vá para Xangô, para todos os santos que estão aqui, no toque